Hi, I'm Geoff Hookham.
And I'm Michael Meany. We're both academics in the School of Humanities, Creative Industries and Social Sciences here at the University of Newcastle. The topic for our paper today is Subversion through Comedy, Gamification and Play in Undergraduate Education.
So to start, we'll do a quick intro to what we plan to do in this presentation. We'll start with the intro, introduce the course, go through working definitions which we use to discuss various topics, then have a look at the links between comedy, gamification and play, how these elements subvert expectations, purposes and applications within education, and then go through the varied slides created for the lecture, which is our case study, and then wrap things up.
So there's been a lot of material written about comedy in education, gamification in education, and play as an element of education. Now, all three of these things have the objectives of improving educational outcomes. However, a review of the applications of comedy or humour, gamification and play reveals some truly incongruous relationships. But one of the things that draws these areas together is the moment of subversion that they offer. And we can playfully subvert elements of our delivery in a way that is purposeful and helps build the student experience.
So our case study is the course CMNS 3560, Interactive Media. This course was focused on developing interaction. We focused on digital and physical interaction and the blending of both. Students were given the option to use a range of technologies. And this could be for entertainment, for information, for education. And it was really designed to allow the students scope to play with different media and digital production skills. And this covered a range of platforms.
We drew students into this course from a communication program, design programs, a Bachelor of Arts programs, and IT programs. So the students coming to the course all brought in with them a different understanding of what interactive media actually meant. So, one of the things we are going to do in the first part of this little presentation is go over our working definitions. In this particular case, it's the distinction between humour and comedy. Frequently in the literature, these words are used almost as synonyms for one another. But one of the things we really want to point out is that comedy is an intentionally structured cultural product. And it uses particular forms to generate an affect, an emotion of amusement in an audience. Where humour is a much broader topic and can be completely unintentional. So it's the intentionality of comedy that we're really interested in here.
One of the ways we viewed and approached the course was to view interactive media through a series of lenses. The first of which was play. Play has many different definitions. Exercise or action for amusement and diversion. Exercise or activity for amusement, recreation, fun, jest. And as you could probably guess, there's really strong indications that play is both something that one must choose to partake of, and usually for fun. Two theorists, Johann Huizinga and Roger Caillois, broke down play into these elements. Play is essentially voluntary. You must choose to be part of it. Imagine playing in the playground, game of tag, someone comes up and tags you and you say, I'm not actually playing, and therefore it discounts you're being tagged. Separate, it's make-believe, it's pretend, and it doesn't always bound itself in reality. The concept of the magic circle where one must jump into this state of play to be part of the play universe generally play isn't productive. It's not really associated with material interest or profit. Some games maybe. But play in essentially not necessarily. It should also be simply fun. These are the two theorists that I mentioned earlier. Huizinga wrote Homo Ludens, a study of play, element, and culture, quite early in the 1900s, and Roger Caillois decided to critique, essentially, Huizinga. But they came to very similar points of view about play, in that it essentially forms a really important part of culture. It shapes learning and social interaction from childhood. And it can be used.
And that's one of the reasons why there's such a strong link between play and pedagogy. That idea that it is one of only a handful of socio-cultural archetypes that seem to exist across all cultures on our planet. People play, and people play and learn frequently at the same time.
So from play, we came to the next lens of games. So games are essentially a structured activity that provides amusement or fun. One of the important parts of a game that differentiates itself from a sense of play, or the term play, is that games have rules, a defined goal. Usually a series of mechanics, if we're talking in digital or physical senses, that define how these games' rules are applied to reach that goal. And gamification builds upon this concept. Gamification is the application of game things. Now, this could be thinking, game play, game elements, rules, goals, that are applied in usually non-game contexts. So this could usually be education, marketing, design, library, business, health. All of these things can be used. It can be used in education, it can be used for entertainment, it can be used to make things that aren't entertaining more entertaining.
But the link between games and non-game situations can also flow in the opposite direction, particularly in the area of undergraduate education. In many respects, the process of getting a degree, it's like many games. You undertake introductory levels where you learn some skills and you parlay up on those skills to attack bigger and darker and meaner giants, and eventually you get to the end and you win by getting a degree. So in some respects, we're looking at a process that is already a game. It's just that most people don't treat it that way.
Well, it's essentially pontification and getting an achievement.
Yeah, we're leveling up. And so between these three areas, comedy, gamification and play, there is considerable overlap. The link, for example, between comedy and gamification is the concept of intention. A comedy is always intentional. It has a target. It has a purpose. Likewise, gamification can take that very open concept of a game and build into it an attention to achieve a particular outcome, whether that is greater scale, greater sales, or better learning, or whatever. There is a sense of intention in there. Between gamification and play is the interesting moment where, for gamification to work, it still needs to be fun. If it isn't fun, it isn't a game, so therefore the gamification has somehow failed.
So this ties into concepts of engagement, motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, where the game itself, the gamification of the non-game environment, needs to actually inspire play.
And that play still needs a sense of freedom. So this link between comedy and play then is the moment of improvisation. And as it suggests in the notes just to the side of this, class interactions are an opportunity for improvisation. It's usually been taken as some kind of pejorative to suggest that somebody was making things up as they go along. But that is exactly the way a class should work. It should be responsive and it should improvise around the core principles and the core purposes of the course.
Yeah, one of the best questions is, so what do you want to do today?
Yeah.
What do you want this to do?
As I suggested earlier, what we're trying to do here is subvert some of the expectations, and using gamification techniques, using comedy and using play, we can subvert the students' expectations and indeed change our own expectations. One of the first expectations we would like to subvert is that this kind of course development is non-didactic in its nature. If a student comes to class expecting to be taught in the old-fashioned sense of, I will say things that are somehow important and you will write them down and potentially you will be tested on that, they'd be really disappointed coming into a class run by Geoff and me.
So most of the time it's let's have a play with this and see what happens.
And it's highly interactive. People are meant to share and play together. So that if a student has a success with a particular technique, a particular layout, a particular strategy, the purpose is for them to share that with everybody else. One of the other ways that we cover or include this concept of subversion is in terms of the course learning outcomes. Now, in an earlier slide we showed these really quickly. They are really, in many ways, quite traditional course learning outcomes. One of the things we are prepared to do, and that this gamification encourages us to do, is to negotiate with the students on an equitable kind of framework how they would go about meeting those course learning outcomes. What production tools they choose to use, what topic they want to tackle. All of these things can be negotiated in a manner that is equitable to all concerned, but is also best targeted to the students' skills and their abilities. Of course, the product that they produce has to achieve certain levels of quality and production skills or production outcomes.
Which is why we designed the final assessment event to be a major physical and digital blended project, where it was essentially on a sliding scale where students got to choose what topic that they wish to focus on, which area they might want to create a gamified application in, and whether or not this existed in the physical realm primarily or the digital realm primarily. Given the limitations of the recent pandemic, most chose the digital option, but several still chose to create board games with digital dice, digital gameplay elements, interactive stories, all sorts of fun stuff.
We had students develop interactive videos because within walking distance of their house, they could actually map an area which was useful to use as, in effect, the board for playing out a real world game on. One of the other elements that we need to subvert is staff-student interactions. All courses in all universities use traditional learning management software tools, be it Canvas or Blackboard or a Moodle or any one of those.
Great for information display.
Yeah, it's a great way of getting a bulk piece of information out to all students. In that sense, it's highly democratic. But also in that sense, it's not personalised.
It's not accessible.
And so when a student has a particular question to achieve a particular outcome, they're unlikely to find that answer inside the course, but they may well be able to find that answer by communicating with the staff and other students. So in the latest iteration of the course, Geoff set up a Discord server so that students could chat directly to one another and directly to us.
Yeah, it's quite easy to set up. It's quite private as well. You can customize access, making sure that students use their real name as nicknames in the listing so that we can match up who is whom. And also set up various groups for group work where only those students in specific groups had access to chat rooms and voice chat, with the proviso that if they were in the voice chat, they could invite me, but as a staff member, I wasn't going to intrude if they needed their privacy.
And it's the sort of tool that allows the staff to help students deal with that problem, which for them at the time is the end of the world, but in reality turns out to be a 5-minute technical fix.
It's really easy just to drop into a chat room, share a screen, find out what the problem is and solve it within a few minutes, as Michael just said.
So in the next series of slides, Geoff's going to go through some of the examples that he used in the lecture series as a way of making the space much more playful and much more interactive.
So I'll start with a preface. These gamified tools were actually based on the platform. We used Zoom as the tool of choice for presenting the lectures. As a result, the platform itself is limited in what we can actually do. One of the tools that we have at our disposal is screen share, voice chat, videoing, text chat, and useful polls. So polls are essentially a great way to introduce a bit of agency for the students, so we used polls. And then using polls as an interactive medium, I designed a series of choose your own adventure elements in a lecture, used a bunch of pop culture trivia that spanned decades because I wasn't quite sure of the ages of the students, and you want to make sure they've got some challenge there. Completely random trivia, which is generally pop culture stuff, see if you can pick it out. Directed trivia, which is really topic specific, and sometimes not as obvious. And then of course a couple of examples of hidden object games, one particularly cruel and one fun. So the first part, you may have noticed that we've used different colours throughout the lecture slides. That is because one of the things that got the students to come back each week was giving them a choice over what colour the slide would be. Every week we'd end with this question and have a series of options in the polls. Other times I introduced various quick polls to say topical questions, often using as many puns as possible, as exemplified by these two amazing puns. There's nothing better than putting the Supremes in a lecture. In week 2 we covered play, and using this structure I created a choose your own adventure game. By giving students the option to choose a path through the information, it gave them the sense that they can direct their learning. So we set up a poll, they chose which option to go for, and we went from the majority. And depending on the choice, it would go to a new area. The thing is, this branching narrative that we created was designed so that every pathway that they took required a key from the other pathway to reach the final stages. And then essentially, we ended with this. Yes, students were railroaded through the lecture slides, but we then discussed the illusion of choice as a really useful tool for students to design their interactive media to give their users a sense of agency, even though they really don't have any.
But one of the beauties of using that branching narrative structure is that it triggers that moment in all of us when we ask the what if question. What if we'd actually taken the other path? What was hiding down there? So we certainly never had to say to students, you're going to have to look at this lecture a couple of times. They did it. They simply chose all of the other paths, which is a nice playful way of making sure that people are engaging with the information.
Then we had a twofold example of pop culture trivia. This one involved a series of identify the movie from which these quotes originate. We've got Sparta and 300 and Jerry Maguire on this one, and also getting the students to pick one of these topics as they went through, ludology or narratology, and then choosing a focus or a goal for their game. The next one I think was a genre, and at the end of this lecture I got them to discuss and come up with a new game concept, but also identify a game that matches these criteria that already exists. And then we went on to serious games, which are games that are used for non-serious purposes. Purposes that aren't purely entertainment. These ones are particularly, this is the directed trivia. Now, this one is particularly interesting. Sea shanties were used not only for fun, but also for synchronizing very important team-based activities. And it's also quite useful because at the time, The Wellerman was a very popular song across many social media platforms, including TikTok, which is unfortunately really useful for you to use if you want to get a beat on what's going on. And most musical interludes, most components can actually be used with a little bit of twisting to suit your purposes. And again, this is just using polls to get students to have a think. And of course, the Jungle Gym monkey bars. This is a really good example of essentially play equipment that was originally designed as a tool to teach children, quite young children, about understanding a Cartesian grid in three-dimensional space, which is really cool. And then, of course, introducing random pop culture elements in the context of theories. So we're discussing flow in the concept of engagement. And then, of course, there's an amazing element in the Avengers movie where Doctor Strange is perusing all 14,605 possible futures.
And the question of the important moment there is linking that necessary understanding of what flow is with a completely understandable example that changes the way they see both the movie and the theory.
It does rely on them having seen the movie. Several of students hadn't yet, so on the fly we came up with a couple of other ones, but yeah, for the most part it works. And then, of course, looking into more dense theory like self-determination theory and whether or not the matrix actually meets the requirements. General consensus from the students was that it does not.
And as you can see, the mix of theory and practice in here is quite deep. There is an absolute nexus of theory and practice.
And then, of course, we get to the absolutely cruelly designed observation hidden object game. In the green one, which I believe was week 5, I just said we're doing an observation game. There's things hidden around here, have a look. And at the end, I asked questions like this. What shape was the dot below the question mark on the have you previously experienced gamification page? It was a diamond. And then, of course, how many completed circles on the key differences page. Now, one of the interesting things about this was a discussion about the importance of introducing your game structures so that people actually know what they're playing. And students were already kind of spending their time looking for movie quotes, looking for pop culture references, which I deliberately did not include in this one.
And once again, this is a moment where the relationship between the instruction team and the students is that the students can actually model their behaviour and even model their projects around the sort of take that the lecturing team has on these topics.
It's a little scary. And then, of course, we followed up with the Fabulous Bee game. The next week, I actually structured the hidden item game, introduced, of course, by Lord of the Rings. And hid a series of bee icons, and of course, knowing me, students managed to find the various bee puns throughout, and they were included in the count. And at the end, we had a quick check. Now, following this slide in the lecture, I actually included a picture of bees that I took in Scotland. They're really fluffy bumblebees, they're absolutely adorable, and we used that as a discussion of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Would they be more likely to focus on finding the bees if they knew they would get a reward of really cool bee pictures, or not?
So, as we've said throughout and argued throughout this paper, gamification is itself a subversive process. And that subversion is really useful because it offers an opportunity to have a fresh look at course content, delivery mechanisms, and interactions. It also offers new and interesting ways of achieving the course learning outcomes. And most importantly, it is disruptive without being destructive. We're not tearing down a structure here, but we are disrupting the way people react and interact with that structure, which in this case happens to be a course.
But one of the things I will note that's particularly useful is this is just an example of one way of approaching gamification of a series of lectures via Zoom. So the platform that you're using is going to influence what kind of interactions can happen. As long as you work out a way that works, you can then build on a series of game examples to incorporate all of these, from storytelling to action games to playing a board game in real life in a park, to all sorts of different ways to approach really disrupting the expected teaching platform.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Yeah, thanks.